Hello and good morning, good afternoon or good evening, depending on what time you're watching/listening to this. Welcome back to another episode of Starmergeddon, TLDR's UK politics podcast. I'm your host back again this week, Georgina Finley, and I'm joined by TLDR's UK politics enthusiast, Mr. Benjamin Blissett.
Got a real upgrade there. I think that's probably fair to say though. Hello.
Yeah, and we're talking about a very exciting topic today.
So exciting. We do it every week, Georgina.
Of course, but particularly exciting today. Do you want to introduce what it is and why it's so exciting?
So it's House of Lords reform, which is something I know that there's a lot of people in this country care very deeply about, mainly those on the left, and it obviously makes sense to talk about it because we now have a government in charge that is pressing ahead with some actual reforms. So with that in mind, I thought it'd probably be good to actually discuss what they're doing and how things are shaping up at the minute.
So what is going on with the House of Lords? What are these new reforms? Is there a bill or something, or is it just come into the media? Why are we talking about it today?
Yeah, so there is a bill going through. It's the Hereditary Peers Abolition Bill, and it was introduced a few months back. But at the minute, it's going through the House of Lords. It's got through the Commons, going through the House of Lords, and there are a number of amendments being proposed to it. But before we get on to the actual amendments, I think it's probably worth first going through how the Lords actually works at the minute and why this bill has been introduced. So anybody that's interested in UK politics will probably know that we have two chambers here. We have the House of Commons and the House of Lords. House of Lords is composed of a number of people who have been appointed for life to sit there. So they don't face elections. There are limited ways to get rid of them. Now, there are three main ways that you can be appointed to the Lords. There are political appointments. So you have things like direct ministerial appointments. If you remember last year, David Cameron was appointed to the House of Lords via a direct ministerial appointment, turned into Lord Cameron so that he could serve as Foreign Secretary. We have dissolution honours, and we have which is at the end of a parliament where parties can put forward names to the Lords, and then we have resignation honours, which when a Prime Minister resigns, Lords can be put in then. We also have the House of Lords Appointment Committee, or HOLAC, which is an independent body. So if you've ever heard of Alan Sugar or industry experts being appointed.
Alan Sugar being our TV show businessman on The Apprentice.
On The Apprentice.
Of course, on the other side of the Atlantic.
Yeah.
He's had a bit of an upgrade.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Future Prime Minister, Lord Sugar. So that's, House of Lords Appointment Committee usually appoint experts to the chamber. And then we also have hereditary peers. Now, this is where all of the change is looking to be made. So hereditary peers are people who inherit a title and are therefore allowed to sit in the House of Lords. In the late 90s, the last Labour government, the new Labour government had put through a bill, the House of Lords bill, which got rid of the vast majority of them. Now, the aim of the bill was actually to get rid of all of them, but because of some behind-the-scenes negotiations, 92 were still allowed to remain. So this was via an amendment called the Wetherell Amendment. Now, that number 92 is frozen. So what actually happens is you have a number of the proportions of people that sit there are sort of defined in law. So we have 2 Labour hereditary peers, 42 Conservative hereditary peers, 28 crossbench, 3 Lib Dem, 15 hereditary peers elected by the whole House, 1 Earl Marshal, 1 Lord Great Chamberlain. So effectively, of that 92, all those numbers add up to 92. So if a Labour hereditary peer resigns, it's the remaining Labour peers in the House of Lords which will appoint another one to fill that position. So that 92 remains static. So unless anything changes, we will continue to have 92 people sitting in one of our chambers in Parliament, voting on laws, and they're only there by virtue of which family they were born in. Again, there are some complicated things to do with this all is to do with elections, but they're elections only of hereditary peers as to who will go into the 92. Sorry, I know it's a little bit complicated, but in essence, it's that we have 92 people who aren't elected that are still there. And it's by virtue of some behind the scenes negotiating by the last Labour government. So it makes sense that this current Labour government wants to sort of finish the work that Tony Blair's government started in getting rid of these 92. And that's where the Hereditary Peers Abolition Bill comes in, because it's technically 8 pages, but actually it's only 2 page. It's a 2-page bill which just amends the House of Lords Act to get rid of the hereditary peers. So it would just get rid of them from the Lords. They wouldn't be allowed to sit in the Lords anymore. That would be done with.
And that is the focus of our main topic today, right?
Yeah.
This new hereditary peers abolition bill.
Exactly.
Can you talk about who proposed it, where it's come from, what kind of support does it have, and what stage are we at with it now?
So Pat McFadden, who is Labour MP in the cabinet, he introduced the bill. So it was introduced a little while ago, last year, and it's made its way through the Commons. So we're now at the stage where the Lords are looking into it now.
Ironic
as you can probably tell, this is where the problems are going to start, because there are some Lords that obviously don't want this to happen. One of the main Lords that is sort of against this is Lord Strathclyde, who is one of the remaining hereditary peers. Who would have guessed? Who is obviously against this, and it's interesting because when you actually look into some of the opposition, look, there's lots of arguments for the Lord. I know the Lords is quite a controversial one, and there were lots of different arguments in favour and against. But if you're looking specifically at hereditary peers, I think most people can look at that and say that all of the arguments for the Lords don't really apply to hereditary peers. Sure, some of them might, like a lot of, if you are going to put in a defence for hereditary Lords, there's some evidence that they engage in the Lords a lot more. And if you get rid of those, it's sort of Lords that aren't doing much work. Getting rid of those that are, you can maybe make that argument. But that's a very sort of specific case, and one that won't necessarily endure over the next 10, 20, hundreds of years. It's not a reason to keep it. It's just an argument for the people who are already there. And, if they are going to be really important in the Lords, there's other ways that you can engage in public life if you really are that way inclined. So, there's not many arguments against. But the really funny thing is, some of the arguments that Lord Strathclyde, one of the main people who defends hereditary peers, makes, it's just quite funny. It's just genuinely quite funny, some of the way they look at this. So there's one of the arguments he made is, we all know each other very well. We sit in the bar together. We discuss our private lives together. We talk about the weather, whatever else. They're our colleagues. They're people we share offices with. And suddenly they're going to be asked to turn on us and boot us out, as if sort of the fact that they all discuss the weather is some reason to keep them in. It is very British. It's absolute madness. Lord Mancroft, a Tory hereditary peer, also made an insane comparison, saying that Angela Rayner is introducing a workers' rights bill, and under her bill, nobody in any British workplace would be allowed to be treated in the way that Labour are treating us. Which, again, I think is just a mad defence of hereditary peers. But yeah, so there's obviously some opposition to this. But the main way, outside of just sort of speaking against it, I think the main way that they're trying to stop this is through amendments. So obviously in the United States, you'll often hear of filibustering, and a very British way of doing that is just to pack a bill, fill it with amendments, and you sort of have to debate them all and vote on them all. And that's sort of what they're doing. And there are some really interesting amendments to the bill. And just to be clear, obviously amendments often don't go through, but it is worth remembering that in the last House of Lords Act, it was an amendment that meant that we have this insane system of hereditary peers today. So there is a very real possibility that some of these amendments will get through and will change, how the Lords works.
So just before we come to some of the specific amendments,
yeah, sure.
What is the current proposition of the bill in its current form? It's to get rid of these 92 hereditary peers completely from the House of Lords, and to replace them with...
So just they would be gone. So
nothing.
Okay. We've got, because the House of Lords is quite large already. It used to be there were 750 hereditary peers, and it's been brought down to 92. It would just be to finish the job off. Right.
So that's what the peers in the House of Lords are working on now. Yeah. With these amendments. Okay, let's hear some of them then.
So
start with your favourite, the most outrageous.
Most outrageous. I think it might be the first in the list of amendments. It's from the Earl of Devon, which inserts a line after the line that basically says get rid of all hereditary peers, that says except for the child or grandchild of the sovereign, which is just outrageous in its sort of... The whole bill is supposed to make it more meritocratic, and the idea that we'll get rid of them all except for some child or grandchild of the monarch. It's just a sort of outrageous proposal. Some of the other ones are actually a little bit more sort of reasonable. Some of them want to introduce a participation requirement. So you'd have to turn up to the House of Lords X number of days in order to maintain your seat. Some of them, there's a number here.
Yeah, because that touches on another question, maybe one of the arguments in favour of getting rid of the hereditary peers. Is it the case that most of them just aren't present for a lot of debates in the House of Lords?
So some would make that argument. There is some evidence that some of the 92 actually do a lot of work. I mean, one of a good example is the Lord Cromwell and Lord Roborough and Viscount Camrose, who all worked very deeply in a law outlawing deepfake pornography. So there are certain lords that have been quite instrumental in some big piece of legislation in the last few years getting the axe. But again, when we're talking about fundamental principles, the actions of one or two lords, I don't think should really come into it, just because you've got a couple of people who do work really hard. And just to be clear, this bill isn't getting rid of the House of Lords as a whole. The other ways of being appointed to the House of Lords would still remain. Again, putting aside the amendments here, like if the bill goes through as it's currently written, there are still other ways into the Lords. And if you are doing a lot of work on that, there's no reason that you wouldn't be appointed on your merit rather than, as a result of your family. So yeah, I don't think that argument holds as much as there are lords that obviously do some good work. There's some other ones as well. There's quite a lot actually of amendments on 15-year terms for life peers. So that would so there's 15 years. There's another one saying retirement at 80, retirement at 85. Another one at retirement at 90.
Wow.
So different sort of
pretty
amendments.
Old retirement age.
Yeah, 90 is.
Yeah, I mean, but also the average age for a member of the House of Lords. We discussed this in the office the other day. Were you there? Do you want to have a guess?
I don't know if I was there. No.
Go on, have a crack.
Oh, he's going to be old, but is it older than I would have originally thought? I mean, I'm going to say 65.
71. The average age for a member of the House of Lords is 71. And I don't know how that's split across the various groups. But, it also kind of plays into this, I guess.
Just on that, so obviously I was saying about retirement ages, there's one amendment saying 80, one saying 85, one saying 90. There's also attendance requirements. There's one of 20% of possible sitting days, 15% as well, or 10%. So there are those. There are removal of peers with a criminal conviction. Again, I don't know how many that would actually remove. So yeah, that's... Oh, sorry, actually, just going back, I should have brought this up at the time. With the retirement ages, in the amendment, they actually have done the maths on how many people it would remove. So retirement from the House of Lords at the age of 80 would remove about 327 peers by 2029. At 85 would remove 185 by 2029. And they haven't actually... Oh, no, they have. Retirement from the House of Lords at the age of 90 would remove 78 peers by 2029. So that just builds into your point about how old the Lords already are. There were also some amendments just to change the whole composition of the House of Lords. And there were also some proposing elections to the House of Lords as well. So there were just a huge amount of amendments. Again, I think a lot of these are probably intended to start conversations about wider House of Lords reform, because to be quite honest, this is a small step in a direction we're already heading in.
This is what I wanted to come to next, is how does this fit into the broader question of whether the House of Lords is still relevant, whether we should still have a House of Lords, and if so, how should people be appointed to it? You've done a lot of videos, I believe, about this in the past.
Yeah.
So yeah, where does this all fit in?
I think this has always been known as like a first step. And even when Blair was making these changes originally, it was understood that the Wetherell Amendment was a temporary thing and they were intending to go further. Just for whatever reason, politics got in the way and they couldn't continue the work. So this is just finishing off something that had started sort of 20 years ago. This is by no means meant to be the end of it. Obviously, Labour in their manifesto last year had already spoken about things like retirement ages for the Lords. They never said that they'd do that in their first year, but it was something that they wanted to look at over the next 5 years. So this is always known as just the first step in direction of House of Lords reform. I think it's a necessary first step. And I genuinely believe that a lot of these amendments, some of them there to delay and are meant as a kind of filibuster, I suppose, but a lot of them I think are trying to start a conversation about the House of Lords. And just getting the public consciousness, I suppose, that this isn't the end of House of Lords reform. There are a lot of people in this country don't believe in the Lords and don't believe it should exist in its current format. And I think this is just sort of trying to give that a platform and try and move the conversation in that direction. And I think, given what was in the manifesto last year, I think Labour seem open to that as well. So yeah.
What's likely to happen with this bill going forward then? Because if it's currently in the hands of people who, out of obvious self-interest, don't support the idea of not losing their own jobs.
Yeah, not every Lord that will be voting on it is a hereditary peer.
So what proportion roughly of the House of Lords are hereditary peers?
So the House of Lords currently has about 835 sitting members. 92 are hereditary.
So there's not enough opposition really within.
No, but there was a question as to how much. Not all 835 will be voting. Not all of them are politically aligned. It's sort of difficult to tell exactly the balances and how people will look at this issue. So it's a little bit tricky. I would suspect that this will get through, just on the grounds of they know what their place is, and there's a very real risk that if they don't agree to this, Labour will come back with something even further, or they'll invoke Parliament Acts, and it all gets quite complicated if they do turn it down. So I really doubt that this will. I really do think this is going to go through, and it's quite an obvious first step as well. Mm-hmm. So as much as it seems like it's not in their own best interests, in a sort of strange, ironic way, I think. If they don't pass it, then Labour are just going to harden their position and go even further more quickly.
Yeah. So if that does happen, then say within a year or so of Starmer coming into Labour government, do you think, this will be a hypothetical question, but do you think it will stop there, or do you think there'll be further House of Lords reforms over the course of Labour's next
I fully believe that there will be. I think this is always intended as a first step. And just to be clear, this should be, and to be honest, outside of the hereditary peers, I think is a relatively uncontroversial move. I don't think you'll find that many people actually ardently arguing in favour of the 92 hereditary peers. It's always intended as a first step. Labour have been clear in the manifesto that they're intending to go further, and there's no reason to suggest that they won't in the next 5 years. Obviously, politics is what it is. We don't know what's going to happen in the next 5 years. Possibly they'll be ground down in Parliament with God knows what else, and the motivation won't be there. But barring that, I see no reason for them not to try and go further in the next 5 years. I mean, even in researching this, I've seen nothing suggesting that anybody's other than the hereditary peers themselves are actually that hard against. And even when you have sort of right-wing papers like the Telegraph reporting on it, there's just not that much sort of pushback on the idea. It's just not that controversial. I think this will go through. I think it will go further. I think we'll see retirement ages for the Lords in the next 5 years as a natural sort of next step. Right.
Well, plenty more Lords content coming then on Starmergeddon. So keep paying attention.
Yeah.
In the meantime, if you want to check out what other kinds of content we're doing here at TLDR, it's no longer not just a YouTube channel, but we also produce 3 times a year, a beautiful physical magazine.
It's the natural next step for an online media organisation.
Yeah, of course. We're going analog again.
Yeah.
It's really lovely. It's a gorgeous magazine with great writing from all of the TLDR team and some extra contributors this time.
Yeah.
Which would be exciting. And so for this edition, we asked you guys to vote for the 25 most influential people in the world. We also did so. And this is the final ranking. I'm not going to give you any clues as to who comes where, apart from
there's a relatively large one on the front.
Red face on the front, which is Mr. Donald Trump. And if you want a copy, you should go to the link in the description. That's toolong.news and check out it on our website. Coming to the next part of Starmergeddon, this is our cabinet review, where every episode we discuss one of Starmer's cabinet ministers, what they're up to, whether things are going well or badly for them. And this week, I've written it down so that you can see with a visual aid. We're talking about Angela Rayner.
Yeah, the Deputy Prime Minister.
The Deputy Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for Housing
and Local Communities.
And there's something else we're missing, I think.
Is there?
Anyway, that's the vibe. So why are we talking about Angela Rayner today?
We're talking about Angela Rayner in her position as Housing Minister, because we've heard a lot in since the election, about the number of houses that the Labour government is planning to build. They're planning to build 1.5 million over the lifetime of the next parliament, which is about 300,000 a year, which is an awful lot and hasn't actually it's received some scrutiny from some sectors, but not really that much. But this week, we've actually had a number of sort of industry bodies actually look into that number and see how feasible that is. And they've been quite scathing about the promise of this new Labour government. Now, we've seen a lot, obviously, about how much they want to build, even just outside of housing, how pro-growth they're trying to be, how they're trying to get rid of like NIMBYism. And I think all of that is laudable, and I think it makes sense given the current situation in the UK. Obviously, a housing crisis. There's a lot to do with other infrastructure, whether it be nuclear power or railways and rail stations and all this. So it makes sense they really want to be pro-building. The issue is, and the issue that the industry experts have raised, is that we sort of just don't have enough builders, and that we don't have the capacity to build all this stuff that they say that they want to build. So the Considerate Constructors scheme, which represents builders, has suggested that the 1.5 million plan just doesn't. We just don't have the workforce, and that without addressing the recruitment crisis, it's not only short-sighted but dangerous when builders are already under immense pressure. So just to put some data into this, as of 2024, there were around 100,000 fewer construction workers in the UK than there were in the last 5 years. And there were sort of two main reasons for this. One of the reasons is a lot of workers left during the pandemic, which led to something of a brain drain of the sort of older workers. And another big reason is the thing that a lot of things always come back to, which is Brexit, because a lot of European builders haven't been able to return to work in the UK as a result of stricter visa requirements. So there's a lot of other sort of underlying things that need to be fixed before we get to this 1.5 million homes. Again, another part of this is that the attraction to construction just isn't really there for younger people, for sort of reasons that you maybe expect if you're trying to think about like what sort of jobs young people want to go into. So a lot of younger people seem to think they're like low skilled and obviously quite physically demanding. So one of the proposals is to try and address the apprenticeship scheme to try and get more younger people into being construction apprentices, and that might be able to fix things. So like with older workers, the issue is that we're not sort of getting more people in this regard when it comes to apprentices. So according to CITB, which is the Construction Industry Training Board, there were approximately 33,000 apprentices at the start of 2022 to 2023, which is a 5% decrease from the previous year. So the issue is that a lot of people are leaving. We're not really getting them back when it comes to apprentices. And obviously Brexit comes into this. Obviously COVID and people leaving also come into this. So I think the overall point here is that Labour have made a promise of 1.5 million new homes, and they've made some like good there's some good indications that they're moving in the right direction when it comes to like planning legislation. Obviously Angela Rayner has been quite open about that in the last 6 months, about reforming reform planning regulation, planning new towns, all of this sort of stuff. But when it actually comes to the structural issues, which is how many workers we have, there hasn't really been that much movement, and this is what is starting to cause a concern. And I think the other thing is that this has just been such a massive promise from Labour. It's something that they've sort of held up as one of the big cornerstones of their government, and if they don't even come near to this target in 5 years' time, that's going to be really difficult to explain to the electorate. So I think this is really important for the government to get right, and it seems that they're just not moving fast enough in some quite critical areas. They're making the right noises, and it seems to most people, if you're saying we're going to change planning legislation, that seems like they're doing the right thing. But when you actually look into it a bit deeper, there's just so many other areas that need changing that they've not even started looking at.
I think this is a really great cabinet review this week. Actually, I'm very intrigued by this story, and it's an angle I hadn't necessarily thought about before, because I think when most of us think about Labour's house building project and targets and things like that, we think about their planning reforms, trying to speed up the planning system, or work more with councils to approve more land, more brownfield sites for development, and all those kinds of very almost macro things. I myself hadn't necessarily thought about the lack of workforce before as an issue. And it's really interesting that that's now come into play. And I think it's maybe an oversight that Labour themselves hadn't foreseen. But you mentioned a few kind of more recent issues that may have led to a drop in the workforce. You cited Brexit and
older workers leaving in COVID. Yeah,
you cited Brexit and older workers leaving during the COVID pandemic. But how? While you were saying this, I was also thinking about, the education system and how that factors into this, which you did touch upon. But how much blame do you think, looking further back, can we put at the feet of New Labour?
Yeah.
And this drive for young people to go to university and go into higher education, and the fact that over the course of a decade or two decades, really important, crucial skills, in construction or any other kind of job that requires vocational training but not, further study, haven't come through because of those.
It's interesting how it comes full circle, isn't it? That it was New Labour that sort of sowed the seeds here, and then it's cropped up in the way that it has. I think, that issue actually comes into a lot of different things. And this comes into sort of like the university crisis that we sometimes talk about on the UK channel as well, which is that, as you say, 20, 30 years ago, you wouldn't have had as many people going to university and taking on the level of debt that they do in order to get jobs. And the result of that has been that a lot of people, getting into their starter jobs, there is now a requirement to have some kind of degree for a job that would not have required a degree 20 or 30 years ago. It's just, this issue crops up. But I think you're absolutely right in that is another issue, that government has pushed so many people down the university route that it's now forced jobs to make that almost a requirement, which means that people have to take on more debt. And as you say, it means that people don't want to get into construction and things like that in the way that they used to. And it should come as no surprise that we don't have enough builders to do to meet the government's targets on house building. This should be obvious given the push that there has been to university in the last 30 years. And just to be clear, I think this is worth pointing out as well. The current government and the previous Conservative government as well has been trying to incentivise apprenticeships more. They've been trying to introduce, they've been doing T levels as well, which has been another way to get people into jobs that are sort of outside of a university path. But again, it's clear that this is moving too slowly for the current government's plans.
I think it's interesting. I see it in other European countries now, and I can see how it ties in with certain voter demographics, voting for parties representing certain industries or even industry itself, and manufacturing and those kinds of really important jobs. It seems to me like in the UK and in possibly other European countries over the past 10, 20 years, there's been a massive devaluing of really important skilled professions.
Absolutely.
In favor of these kind of, high-skilled academic type roles or jobs that, I don't know, like that's how I kind of see it. And I see people's frustration now with the establishment as a whole, which has neglected, I think, really important parts of life, like people who build homes and people who nurses who can help, and midwives who can help birth children, and paramedics and all these kinds of jobs that you don't hear enough about because we're just told, we're told about high-skilled IT jobs or high-skilled AI and all these kind of, I don't know.
Well, I think you're right. And I think these sorts of issues are going to crop up. We had this with the HGV driver shortage a few years ago, which, turned out that was a very well-paid job, and there was very much, we were in need of more HGV drivers, and there was that crisis a few years ago. Obviously, this is happening now again with construction workers. This is going to keep cropping up until government puts more attention into getting people to go down non-traditional, non-university routes. This is an obvious outcome of that. You're absolutely right that this is a natural outcome of the decision in the late 90s, early 2000s to push as many young people into university as possible and to take on huge amounts of debt. It was a natural outcome that a lot of jobs that didn't need degrees would make them a requirement simply because so many people had them. And the outcome also is that in other sort of construction jobs, things like that, HGV drivers, etc., few and few people do that, and that's the natural conclusion. So I absolutely think you're right, and I think that I don't think this ends here. I think this is going to keep happening over the next few years until there's a natural change.
Yeah, and it seems like it's going to be a massive challenge for Labour, I guess.
Yeah.
Because they seem to have only just kind of, as we have as well, just kind of cotton onto it.
Yeah, but we're not the government.
That's true. We just
Yeah.
comment on them.
Yeah.
We critique it.
Yeah. They should have
Yeah.
known.
Kind of moving on to the final part of our podcast now. This is our additional extra story, which is sometimes related to the main one, sometimes not. Just something that we find interesting, we want to talk about. And this one is from me today, I guess, if I can say that. And my story is about blue Labour. How much do you know about blue Labour?
I know what we discussed earlier in the office. Outside of that, I've heard it as a phrase, but I've not looked into it too deeply.
I didn't know too much about it until this week either, and I think most people don't know that much about it, which is why I want to talk about it now. And so, blue Labour, effectively, the reason this has kind of come back into conversation. It's been an idea that's been dormant for over a decade now. But on the 1st of February, 4 red wall Labour MPs, so from constituencies in the north of England, which were traditional working class Labour strongholds, and are now being quite hotly contested by reform challenges, and which of course fell to the Conservatives in 2019. So 4 red wall Labour MPs, Dan Carden, Jonathan Hinder, Jonathan Brash and David Smith, have reinvigorated or revived this parliamentary caucus from within Labour, which kind of came and died around 2010, 2011. And blue Labour is so called not because of the Conservatives, but actually, as a homage to blue collar workers, basically taking Labour back to, I guess, more working class roots, kind of socially conservative but economically left wing socialism.
Yeah,
and we're seeing basically the reason this has started to come back into the media is because earlier this month, Maurice Glasman, who was the main kind of proponent of this version of Labour back in the Ed Miliband era, asserted that Morgan McSweeney, who we all know a lot about, Starmer's chief of staff, he referred to Morgan McSweeney as one of ours. So this has kind of reinvigorated the debate because it's drawn a line between Starmer's Labour and this dormant or now revived movement, which people don't know much about, in a quite interesting way. And it also ties in with things we've seen from Labour in the past few weeks. I don't know if you've spotted those bright blue immigration adverts that Labour have been paying for on Facebook, effectively using the reform colour, the branding, to make a big deal out of how many deportations they're successfully managing to do and all this kind of thing. And so that there's now a bit of a emerging conversation about the direction that Starmer's Labour is going in, or whether this blue Labour movement could be having a revival and kind of
and is the suggestion that they're not right-wing enough socially, and that the blue Labour movement want the government to move further right socially in order to be successful?
It's kind of, yeah. So basically, in the early years of this movement, in 2011, I think it was, or might have been, it was 2010/11, there were a series of meetings, I think just 4 meetings, in London and Oxford between a number of blue Labour affiliated MPs at the time, which resulted in the publication of an essay series called The Labour Tradition and the Politics of Paradox. And you can find it online.
Party started.
Yeah, catchy name.
Yeah, an essay series is always how it starts, isn't it?
You can find it online. It was very controversial at the time, and I don't know enough about the controversy to be able to talk about it in depth. But effectively, my understanding is there were 2 kind of main ideas that were communicated in this essay series, to which actually David Lammy, the Starmer's foreign secretary, contributed, and David Miliband, of course, brother of Ed. And he's now head of the IRC.
Yeah, he had loads of roles in previous governments and shadow cabinets.
But so some quite high high-profile British politicians have contributed to this series. And basically, there were two kind of main ideas within it. The first being that Labour, over the past few decades, has undervalued, this is the kind of social conservatism aspect, undervalued the importance of religious belief, the family, and tradition in bringing society together. So an emphasis on kind of community, solidarity, togetherness, over, I suppose, an emphasis on what we might now call identity politics, or those kinds of, someone versus someone else kind of cultural debates. And the second big thing that came out of this essay series was that as a result of that, Labour need to focus more on community activism and local activism, which has been lost over the past decades. And I believe the Blue Labour movement kind of held up Obama's community organising as a form of what Labour needed to emulate. And
there's something Lib Demi about it. Maybe it's the local aspect.
I think so.
Maybe it's the sort of economically-ish left, socially. I don't know. There's something is screaming Lib Dem.
It's interesting though, because just a glance over the Blue Labour website, which is very rudimentary. It's kind of just a series of blog posts written by one guy, I think.
Not quite an essay series.
Not quite an essay series.
No.
But there's some interesting contradictions in some of the language used, and it's a bit unclear, I think, clearly because it's been a dormant movement for so long with so few people involved, what they are really trying to push or trying to stand for. In that there was one sentence that said something like, "We are both radical and conservative." And that's quite an interesting pair of words to put together.
You can't put those two words together. They are a contradiction.
Well, Blue Labour would argue that you can.
Blue Labour were wrong.
Well, it's up for debate, but it's an interesting phenomenon anyway, I guess, and one to watch potentially.
Yeah.
Also, you've got this guy, Maurice Glassman, saying in January that he has, I think, pitched or is planning or wants to do a GB News show called Blue Labour versus Reform, whereby he would head-to-head debate Nigel Farage constantly. But all this is to say that there's some interesting kind of sub-movements popping up across Labour. Of course, we've got the former Labour MPs now who've in their independent group as well. So whether this will cause further splits and divisions within left and within Labour, or whether it will come through as kind of the new driving force is obviously yet to be seen. But it's an interesting phenomenon.
Yeah, I think it's natural that you're going to have different factions within the Labour Party start to crop up when your polling starts to drop. You saw this with Corbyn when he was in. You had different factions try and sort of take him on, and now the sort of relatively centrist sort of Labour government under Starmer isn't doing so well. I think it's natural that a party like this, especially concerned about the rise of reform and the way that they're starting to target Labour, it's sort of natural that this would happen. And I would also expect a left-wing faction to crop up at some point as well. I think Starmer's job is just trying to hold the ship together at the minute, and try to suppress these factions from making too much ground.
Well, we shall see in time
see
whether
see how Blue Labour get on.
With that, let's bring a close to this episode. Thanks for watching/listening. We'll be back with you in 2 weeks' time for the next episode of Starmergeddon.
Yeah.
Anything to add?
I have nothing left to add.
Nothing left to add. So, see you. Yeah. Bye.
Goodbye.